Garbage, that's who you are. Look at him. He's actually cleaning up his mess.
The day Vernetta Simmons Holt called him garbage, she was wearing a new watch. He noticed it because he had been on his knees less than 3 feet from her station, pressing a mop into a coffee spill she had created by turning too fast without acknowledgement, and the watch caught the overhead fluorescent light in a way that threw a small gold flash across the wet floor. A Cartier, vintage tank, the kind his mother used to wear on Sundays to church before she passed. He wrung out the mop. He said nothing. She laughed at something her colleague said and stepped over his bucket without looking down. That was a Wednesday. By the following Thursday, Vernetta Simmons Holt would be sitting across from a compliance officer, and the watch, that particular watch, would become exhibit number 4 in a financial fraud investigation that would reshape the entire executive floor of First Meridian Bank. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Dear friends, welcome. If this is your first time here, you are exactly where you need to be. Before we go any further into this story, hit that subscribe button right now, tap the like button, and turn on your notification bell so you never miss what we drop next. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. We like to know where this story reaches. Now let's begin. His name was Cornelius Thelonious Beaumont Wells. The Thelonious came from his grandfather, a jazz musician from Atlanta who had played small rooms and large dreams across the American South for 40 years, fallen in love with a woman named Cressida at a church social in Birmingham, Alabama, and built a life around music and her in equal measure. Cornelius had his grandfather's hands, wide palms, long fingers, the kind of hands that looked built for precision, and his father's eyes, which were quiet and deep-set and gave nothing away. He was 31 years old. He had a first-class degree in economics from UCL, a master's in behavioral finance from LSE, and a published paper on regulatory arbitrage that 3 separate central banks had requested copies of before he turned 27. He reported to work at First Meridian Bank's flagship Atlanta branch on a Monday morning in a gray uniform and rubber-soled shoes that squeaked on the marble when the floor was still damp. His employee ID read, C. Wells, maintenance staff. He had chosen Wells deliberately. His father's name, Reginald Beaumont, appeared on every wall in this building in one form or another. On the founding charter framed behind the CEO's desk, on the granite plaque at the entrance, on the legal documents filed with federal regulators naming the controlling family shareholder. Cornelius had left London not because he had failed there, but because he had grown afraid of a specific kind of success, the kind you inherit without earning. The kind that arrives pre-attached to a surname and a board seat in a corner office with furniture no one picked out for themselves. He had watched men 10 years older than him hollow out from the inside in exactly that arrangement, and he had told his father one evening over smothered chicken and sweet potatoes in silence that he needed to understand the bank from the floor before he could lead it from the top. His father, who was a man of measured responses and extraordinary patience, had set down his fork and looked at his son for a long moment. How long, his father had asked. Until I know what I need to know, Cornelius had said. His father had nodded once. Then he had picked his fork back up. That was the agreement. No executive notification. No staff briefing. No safety net beyond the fact that his father, Reginald Beaumont, knew where his son was mopping floors. The branch was a statement building. 22 floors of glass and structural steel in Midtown Atlanta, with a banking hall on the ground floor that could make a first-time visitor stop walking simply from the scale of it. The ceilings were high. The marble was Italian. The customer service counters ran the full length of the eastern wall in a curve of brushed chrome and frosted glass, and behind those counters, 8 cashiers worked in shifts, processing transactions and managing a volume of daily foot traffic that would have broken a smaller institution. 3 of those cashiers ran the floor in a way that had nothing to do with their official job descriptions. Vanetta Simmons Holt was the senior cashier. She had been with the bank 11 years and wore that tenure with the confidence of someone who believed duration was the same thing as authority. She was efficient, quick with numbers, and possessed a specific skill for reading a room's social hierarchy and positioning herself at its center. She was not unlikable in the way cartoon villains are unlikable. She had warmth when warmth served her. She laughed well. She remembered names and birthdays and small personal details that made people feel seen. The problem with Vernetta was not her personality. It was her architecture, the internal framework she had built around the belief that some people counted and some people were furniture, and that a uniform told you everything you needed to know about which category a person occupied. Beside her worked Charisse Fontaine-Dupree. Charisse was 33, had a degree she never talked about, and managed her frustration at her own career trajectory by constructing elaborate social performances in which she was never on the losing side. She followed Vernetta's lead with the consistency of someone who had decided that alignment was safer than originality. The third was a man named Deshaun Pickett. He was younger, just 26, and had joined the cashier unit 8 months ago with a charm that had curdled over time into something more calculated. He drove a car that did not correspond to his salary, and he was the one who had first introduced the phrase "the ghost" as a nickname for Cornelius, because, Deshaun said, cleaners in this bank are invisible. They are not even really here. Cornelius had overheard this on his 3rd day. He had continued mopping. The 4th cashier was named Lavette Ingram Good. She was 28. She had transferred from the bank's Charlotte branch 14 months ago following a departmental restructuring, and she had brought with her a reputation for 0 transaction errors in 3 consecutive years, which was a record the branch manager had mentioned once at a team meeting and which Vernetta had responded to with applause that lasted exactly 1 second too short. Lavette wore her hair natural, pulled back on working days, and she had the specific kind of stillness that comes not from passivity, but from a person who has decided that their energy is a resource to be spent deliberately rather than scattered. She was not cold. She was simply present in a way that most people were not, the kind of present that meant she actually heard what was said to her, noticed what was happening around her, and formed her own conclusions rather than borrowing someone else's. She had spoken to Cornelius for the first time on his 5th day. He had been replacing the water in the mop bucket near the eastern wall when a customer's child had broken free from a stroller and sat down directly in the wet floor area, and the mother had panicked, and in the confusion someone had knocked over a cup of water from the service counter. Cornelius had moved quickly to prevent the child from sliding, steadied him by the shoulders, and the child had looked up at him with enormous eyes and laughed. Lavette had watched this from behind her counter. When the mother had gathered the child and moved on, still flustered, and when Deshaun had made a comment from 3 stations over that involved the words janitor and babysitter, and had produced a snicker from Charisse, Lavette had looked directly at Deshaun and said, "He just kept that child from hitting marble. Say thank you or say nothing." The banking hall had not gone silent. It was too large and too busy for that. But within their immediate cluster of counters, something had shifted. Deshaun had looked at his screen. Cornelius had returned to his bucket. He had not looked at Lavette, but he had registered everything. By the end of his 2nd week, Cornelius had mapped the branch's informal power structure with the precision his LSE professors would have recognized from his dissertation methodology. He kept notes in a small hardcover book he bought from a stationery vendor outside the building. Not observations about specific people. He was not building a personal dossier out of resentment. He was doing what he had always done, observing systems, tracking patterns, identifying the gap between how an organization presented itself and how it actually functioned. What he found in the banking hall bothered him at a level that had nothing to do with how he was personally treated. The customers who came in wearing work clothes, the contractors, the market traders, the women carrying children on their hips, waited longer between counter calls. Not because the system was overloaded, because the priority queue was being managed informally by whoever was working the floor, and that management reflected a set of values that had nothing to do with the bank's stated commitment to equitable service. He watched Vernetta process a transaction for a man in a tailored suit in under 4 minutes, then spend 11 minutes on a call when a woman in a church hat and Sunday shoes, carrying a worn envelope of documents, was at the counter with a straightforward transfer request. He watched Charisse redirect a customer to the wrong desk twice, and the second time, she had been on her phone when she did it. He watched Deshawn. Deshawn was the most interesting problem, because Deshawn was excellent with certain customers in a specific and deliberate way. He was fluent, warm, attentive, thorough, but only with a subset of customers he appeared to have pre-identified. He kept a mental list, and Cornelius watched him work through it over the course of several days. And then he started paying attention to what those specific customers had in common. They were all depositors, high value, repeat visitors, the kind of customers who came in with physical documents and handled transactions above the standard retail threshold. And every time those customers left Deshawn's counter, Deshawn would make a small notation in a personal notebook he kept beside his terminal, not the official transaction log, which was system recorded and auditable. A personal one, small, spiral-bound, blue. Cornelius noted the notebook on day 9. By day 14, he had formed a hypothesis. By day 21, he had enough observational data to know the hypothesis was directionally correct. He did not move on it yet. On the 23rd day, Vernetta called him garbage. Not directly. She was speaking to Charisse, and the word she used was debris, and the context was a conversation about the bank's upcoming staff recognition gala, who deserved to attend, who was support infrastructure, and therefore outside the scope of the celebration. But the intention of the word was clear, and it was directed at the maintenance staff category with a specificity that everyone within earshot understood. Cornelius was 6 feet away with his cart. He moved the cart to the next section. That evening, he called his father. "How is it?" his father asked. "Educational," Cornelius said. A pause. "Are you ready to come up?" "Not yet." Another pause. Then, "Your grandfather used to say that you cannot lead what you cannot stand inside of." He was talking about jazz, but I have always thought it applied to other things. "Yes," Cornelius said. "I think so too." They talked for another 3 minutes about nothing consequential, and when Cornelius ended the call, he sat in his 1-bedroom apartment in Vine City. He had insisted on renting accommodation appropriate to a maintenance salary, because the exercise only worked if it was real, and he opened his notebook. He drew a line under his existing observations. He wrote one sentence below it. The Deshawn problem is not individual. It has infrastructure. She brought him food on a Tuesday, not in a grand gesture. She had made extra the night before, packed a portion in a glass container with a blue lid, and left it at the maintenance station break area with a note that said, "For whoever needs it today." But she had placed it at the time she knew he would be cycling through that area, and when he arrived, she was already gone back to her counter, and the container was there, and the note was in handwriting he recognized from the internal memo she had written to the floor manager about the broken AC unit near counter 4, which had been affecting the elderly customers who waited longest. He ate the food. He returned the container to her counter at the end of his shift. "Thank you," he said. "It was good." She looked at him directly, the way she looked at everything. "My grandmother's recipe. She makes her cornbread dressing with a particular blend of sage and celery that nobody in the family has been able to reproduce exactly." "The sage was right," he said. "Whatever you changed in the celery ratio, pull it back slightly." She considered this for a moment. "You cook." "I was in London for 7 years." "You learn to feed yourself?" or you disappear. Something in her expression changed. Not dramatic, just a small recalibration, the kind a person makes when they receive information that adjusts their existing picture of someone. She did not pursue it. She thanked him for the feedback on the celery. He moved on with his cart. That was the beginning. Over the following weeks, they built something that had no name because neither of them assigned one. She brought food twice more. He fixed the hinge on the staff bathroom door that she had mentioned to the facility's manager twice without result, and she did not ask how he had managed it or whether it was in his job scope. They talked during his break periods, 15-minute windows where he sat near the service corridor entrance and ate whatever he had brought, and she would sometimes be passing, and sometimes she would stop, and sometimes they would cover 3 topics in 12 minutes and run out of time mid-sentence. She talked about her mother in Birmingham, who was raising her younger sister's 2 children and had recently developed a problem with her left knee that no one in the family was taking seriously enough. She talked about the Charlotte branch, why she had requested the transfer, which she described with careful neutrality that told him more than the words themselves did. She had left because someone in authority had behaved in a way that made her continued presence in that office a daily negotiation with her own self-respect. She did not elaborate. He did not press. He talked about London in the winter, which he described as a particular shade of gray that had no equivalent in the American South. Not the gray of rain, not the gray of concrete, but the gray of a sky that has simply decided to withhold. He talked about his grandfather's jazz records, which his father kept in a dedicated room in the family house in Buckhead. He talked about the paper he had written on behavioral finance, which he described as something I put a lot of time into, without further qualification. She gave him a look at that. What kind of janitor writes behavioral finance papers? The kind that reads a lot, he said. She held the look for a moment longer than necessary. Then she moved on. He watched her walk back to her counter and thought about the weight of a secret carried for 31 days, and whether it was honest to keep it from someone who had treated him with more straightforward dignity than people who had known him for years. He did not yet have an answer to that question. On day 38, a customer came in whose name Cornelius recognized. Mr. Eldridge Fontaine, a real estate developer. A man his father had mentioned once at a Sunday dinner as the kind of customer who holds a bank together at the base. Not flashy, but consistent. He was 60, broad across the shoulders, and he had the deliberate movements of someone who did not rush, because he had decided long ago that rushing was not a character trait he was interested in cultivating. He wore a plain gold wedding band and carried his documents in a brown leather portfolio worn soft at the corners from years of use. Deshawn saw him come in and was visibly activated. He straightened. He called across to redirect Mr. Fontaine to his counter specifically. Cornelius was near the eastern wall. He had a reason to be there. He stayed. He watched the transaction unfold. It was a large deposit, physical cash, which still happened at this volume at certain business-oriented branches. Deshawn counted. He logged. He handed over the receipt. Mr. Fontaine folded it without looking at it, which Cornelius suspected was a habit of long trust, and left. Deshawn opened his blue notebook. He made his notation. Cornelius moved his cart 2 feet to the left and observed the notation from an angle that was not direct but was sufficient. Deshawn wrote 2 things, a figure and a reference code. The figure was not the deposit figure. Cornelius knew this because he had seen Vernetta, in the same transaction, enter a secondary adjustment that was system-triggered, but the adjustment was manual, which meant it required authorization, and the authorization code used was not Vernetta's. It was a supervisor code, a code that, at this branch, belonged to only 2 people. One of them was in Charlotte at a training conference. The other was the branch manager, a man named Mr. Caldwell Dupree Morris, who had been with the bank for 19 years and who Cornelius had always seen in a specific window office on the mezzanine and who smiled at everyone in the building with the warmth of a man who felt genuinely good about his life. Cornelius spent the next 4 days moving through every position in the banking hall that his work schedule could plausibly justify. He was thorough, and he was invisible, and he was very good at creating reasons to be in a specific location at a specific time. What he assembled, through direct observation and the careful documentation of patterns he could later cross-reference against public transaction data, was the architecture of a skimming operation. Not a crude one, not the kind that a basic audit would catch. It was precise and patient, and it had been constructed over time by someone who understood the bank's internal systems deeply enough to use the system's own error correction protocols as the vehicle for extraction. The amounts per transaction were small enough to fall below the automatic flag threshold. Multiplied across the volume of high-value transactions this branch processed monthly, the aggregate was considerable. He calculated it on a Thursday evening, sitting at the small desk in his Vine City apartment. He sat with that number for a while. Then he called his father. "I need to come up," he said. A pause. "What did you find?" "Something that cannot wait." He arrived at the branch on a Monday wearing the same gray uniform. He signed in at the maintenance log. He collected his cart. He worked his first 2 hours exactly as he always did: floors, bathrooms, the service corridor, the ATM vestibule. Vanetta arrived at 8:15 and did not look at him. Charisse arrived at 8:40 and dropped a takeout container in the corridor 2 feet from a trash bin without pausing. Deshawn arrived at 9 and went directly to his terminal with the focused energy of someone who had a plan for the day. Levette arrived at 8:55, saw Cornelius near the counter area, and said good morning. He said good morning back. She looked at him for a beat longer than usual. She had been doing that more frequently in recent days, a look that was working something out without yet having all the information, and then she moved to her counter. At 10:15, 3 men entered through the main entrance wearing clothes that told nobody anything in particular, and they went directly to Mr. Dupree Morris's mezzanine office. At 10:22, 2 women from the compliance division arrived and went to the same office. At 10:30, the branch received a communication from the group's internal audit department requesting that all cashier terminals be locked pending a system verification. Vanetta looked up from her counter. Deshawn's hands went still. Cornelius was mopping the area near the eastern wall. He was watching Deshawn's face with his peripheral vision, and what he saw there was not panic. Not yet. It was the expression of a person running rapid internal calculations, assessing exits, reviewing what was documented versus what existed only in memory. The blue notebook was in Deshawn's drawer. Cornelius knew this because he had seen him put it there 40 minutes ago. At 10:45, Reginald Beaumont walked through the front entrance of his own bank. He was 63. He dressed the way men dress when they have nothing to prove: a well-made charcoal suit, a tie his wife had given him in 1993, cufflinks that had belonged to his own father, shoes that were excellent and old. He moved without announcement through the banking hall, and the few staff members who recognized him stopped what they were doing with the specific paralysis of people who are encountering a version of reality they had not prepared for. Mr. Dupree Morris appeared at the top of the mezzanine stairs and came down quickly. Reginald shook his hand. He thanked him for his years of service. He said this directly and without irony, because it was true that Mr. Dupree Morris had served 19 years, and it was also true that Mr. Dupree Morris had spent the last 11 months signing off on a scheme that he had either architected or permitted. Mr. Dupree Morris said nothing. His face did what faces do when the structure of a life begins to give way. Vanetta had stood up from her counter. Charisse had not moved. Deshawn had reached toward his drawer. One of the compliance women said, from 3 feet away, "Please leave the terminal and the drawer as they are, sir." Deshawn's hand stopped. The banking hall had gone genuinely quiet by this point. Customers at the counters were watching. Tellers across the room had straightened. Someone had turned off the background music that piped through the overhead speakers every business morning. Reginald Beaumont walked across the floor of his bank, and when he reached the maintenance station near the eastern wall, he stopped. Cornelius turned around. His father looked at him. Cornelius looked at his father. "Done?" his father asked. "Yes," Cornelius said. Reginald put his hand on his son's shoulder for exactly 3 seconds. The grip was firm. Then he moved toward the compliance team. Vanetta Simmons-Holt stood at her counter and watched a man she had called Debris receive his father's hand on his shoulder in the middle of her banking hall. There was no dramatic music, no speech, no moment designed for her benefit. That was the thing about the way it happened. It was not staged for impact. It was simply the sequence of events arriving in their correct order, and the impact was a byproduct of the truth rather than a performance of it. Cornelius had not arranged this as a humiliation. He had arranged it as a correction. The humiliation was Vernetta's own contribution, a thing she had been building toward for 40 days without realizing the structure she was constructing. Deshawn was escorted to a side room. Mr. Dupree Morris followed the compliance team upstairs. Charisse sat down. Livette was at her counter. She had not moved. She was watching Cornelius with an expression that was not shock. She did not have the expression of someone who had been entirely fooled, because she was not someone who was easily fooled. She had the expression of a person whose existing read on someone has been confirmed in a much larger and more definitive way than they had anticipated. Cornelius walked to her counter. He was still in the gray uniform. "How long have you been doing this?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. 41 days, he said. "What did you need to find?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Whether the people in this building see the people in this building," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "And what did you find?" "Most don't," he said. "A few do." She looked at him with the directness she brought to everything. "You should have told me." "Yes," he said. "I know." That was the moment he felt the weight of what the secret had cost, not in terms of professional stakes or personal risk, but in the specific currency of a relationship that had been built with honesty on one side and necessary concealment on the other. She had given him food and conversation and defense and her grandmother's cornbread dressing recipe, and he had given her all of himself except his name. "I'm sorry," he said. She did not tell him it was fine. She did not perform forgiveness for the audience of a room still absorbing everything. She said, "We will talk," and returned to her screen. That was more than enough. The investigation took 11 weeks. The total extracted from high-value customer accounts over the preceding 2 years was recovered in full. Mr. Eldridge Fountaine and 6 other customers were notified directly, with personal calls from Reginald Beaumont that lasted long enough to be conversations rather than apologies. Restitution was complete before the investigation concluded. Mr. Dupree Morris resigned. He did not face criminal charges. Reginald had made a specific decision about that, one that cost him personally, because the Dupree Morris family and the Beaumont family had a history of 30 years, stretching back to a church in southwest Atlanta where both men's fathers had been deacons. Reginald believed that accountability did not have to be identical to destruction. Dupree Morris's pension was voided. His professional future in the banking sector was over. Reginald felt the weight of that decision for months. Deshawn Pickett was prosecuted. The blue notebook was exhibit number 1. The Cartier watch that Vernetta had been wearing on the Wednesday of the mop spill was exhibit number 4, purchased with funds from a secondary account that the investigation traced through 4 transactions. Vernetta's role was determined to be proximate rather than central, which is the legal way of saying she had benefited from proximity to the scheme without being an architect of it. She was dismissed. The professional consequence was total, and it was arrived at through process rather than theater. Charisse was cleared of direct involvement, but did not survive the restructuring that followed. Cornelius took the executive vice president position his father had been holding open. On his first day in the office, he sent a formal request to the new branch manager that the maintenance staff be included in the annual recognition gala, with full participation and equal dinner placement. The request was granted without question. On the evening of the gala, Lavette arrived in a deep burgundy dress and wore her hair down for the first time he had seen, and he watched her come through the entrance of the event space and felt something settle in him that had been unresolved for months. Not the thrill of possession or the satisfaction of outcome, but the quieter, more durable feeling of a person who has found someone whose way of moving through the world he genuinely respects. He crossed the room to her. "You came," he said. "I told you I would," she said. "You also told me we would talk." She looked at him. "We have been talking. You know what I mean." She did. She was quiet for a moment in the specific way she was quiet when she was deciding rather than hesitating. "The first day you fixed that hinge," she said, "I knew you were not what the uniform said. Not because of anything arrogant, just because of how you did it. Careful. No announcement. Like a person who knew how to do something well and was not interested in being watched doing it." He had nothing to say to that except, "My grandfather would have liked you." "The jazz musician?" she said. He looked at her. "I never told you that." "You told me about the records," she said. "I did the math." He smiled. She smiled. The room moved around them with music and the kind of laughter that comes from people who have earned the right to celebrate. And the warmth of the evening settled over everything the way warmth does when it is genuine and nobody manufactured it. If this story moved you, if it made you think about how you judge people, how you treat people when no one important is watching, share it right now. Someone in your life needs to hear this today. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us the one sentence from this story that is going to stay with you. We read every single one, every single comment. Until next time, hold your worth. Hold it quiet. Hold it long enough. The people who know exactly what they are worth never have to announce it. They just have to hold it, quiet enough, long enough, until the moment the room figures it out on its own.